Hey guys, doing my second episode on Hearts in Atlantis. This time I'm doing the title story in Hearts in Atlantis. And once again, this time I'm going to be reading directly from my notes because there's a lot to talk about and I don't want to forget anything, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. So this is the second story in the book. It is also novella length. It is also the second longest story in the book, behind the first story, Low Men in Yellow Coats. The first one as well as this one both take up a huge span of the book. This edition has almost 700 pages, and this one and the first story take up over 500 of its run. In this story, we're introduced to a new character. His name is Peter Riley. He's a student at the University of Maine in Orano. The year is 1966, and he's just a normal guy just trying to make it through his classes. He gets caught up in a obsession that spreads around his dorm for a card game called Hearts. The object of the game is to find the Queen of Hearts. And not only him, but all of his roommates get swept up in this game, and they're just playing constantly. They start losing track of their grades and going to classes, and almost lose touch with reality around them as a whole. And this, of course, is a subtext of what's going on around them in the world. It's not blatantly spoken, but it's clearly shown that this obsession with the card game is a way to escape from the turmoil of the times around them. A way to ignore the fact that there's a war going on. That their classmates are getting sent via the draft to go die in this war, and they're trying to get away from all this by kind of ignoring reality and getting swept up in this card game. So while they're all playing the card game, Peter meets Carol, who is a character from the first story. In this one, she is a grown woman. She's attending, the University of Maine as well. They like each other right off the bat, and a romance ensues, and they go on a few dates. And Peter quickly finds out that she's more involved with protestation. She's more caught up in the whole trying to protest the war. It's her own way of kind of cathartically dealing with emotions and things that from her childhood. A way of kind of, in her own way, coping with the stuff going on around her as well. Whereas Peter chooses to run away from it, she chooses to confront the war but ignore aspects of her own personality that get her caught up in her own obsession. She also becomes part of a radical collective of college students that are very adamantly against the war, and her protestations with them, you find out at the end of the story, spoilers, get more and more violent. And at the end of it, he's reminiscing on the Carol that he knew as opposed to the Carol that she wound up being. When she sends him a newspaper clipping of her getting arrested with her comrades, and she's bloodied from police beating, and she's very defiantly and triumphantly smiling about it. It's very good. This is actually my favorite story in the collection. So much for my notes. I'm just gonna wing it. It's my favorite one. I think it's the best one. It's the best written one, and I just kind of like the attitude of how clear and kind of cold-eyed it is about all these things. It's written in the first person, unlike the first story. It's all entirely from Peter's perspective as he's narrating these events going on. And it's definitely kind of a coming-of-age story in its own way. The first one was more overt. This one's a coming-of-age story going from adolescence into adulthood, as well as finding out who you really are, growing as a person, and coming to change negative things about yourself and embracing positive ones and choosing to continue forward in those positive traits about yourself. There's a lot. I mean, there's not a whole lot going on surface wise, but there's a lot going on with character. There's a lot of like character driven stuff in the second story. Like I said, there's the main character Peter, and then his roommates, and like he, in his dorm, and it's an all male dorm, by the way. They're all getting caught up in this card game of hearts. Right away when he meets Carol, she realizes how stupid this is and tells him like, repeatedly, hey, stop playing that stupid card game. And meanwhile, like, everyone is ignoring their grades and their responsibilities, so much so that little by little they're getting picked off. Their grades aren't kept up, so they're slowly like losing their roommates more and more to the draft. And still they can't help themselves but to keep plowing ahead and ignoring the dangers around them, the dangerous potential to be shipped off next. It's interesting. There's another character his name is Stokely Jones. He's this crippled guy who always walks around on crutches, but he's very he's very proud. He doesn't want to ask for help. He doesn't want anyone's pity. So much so that he specifically requests like a room on the 3rd floor that he has to go up the stairs to get to on his crutches. He doesn't want anyone's help. He's this kind of misanthropic jerk to everyone. But he's also in Carol's like radical student collective. So much so that like he is like overtly demonstrating by like spray painting things on the wall like "fuck Johnson" and things like that. Which at the end of the story, the RA is like trying to finger someone who did this because someone spray painted "fuck Johnson" U.S. at a nom now with a peace sign. And they're like, well, Stokely always has a peace sign, but the other guys actually come to Stokely's defense after like kind of ragging on him and being assholes to him. And they point out that, hey, we're all wearing peace signs. If you're gonna blame him, you can blame all of us, and that kind of gets Stokely off the hook. And there's another moment. There's another scene where the dudes are all playing cards, and they look out the window, and it's like this huge storm going on. It's like flooding the campus. And Stokely is actually trying to get across campus in all this rain, and he like slips, he falls, and then loses one of his crutches. And they all start laughing at him. They think it's hysterical. Like, there's something about that strikes them as funny, and they all start laughing. But then, gradually, as they're laughing, Peter starts to realize, this isn't nice. I shouldn't be laughing at this guy's misfortune. Why are we laughing? And it disturbs him so much so that he takes a serious look at himself. He kind of takes a step back and is like, I shouldn't be laughing at this guy. I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I shouldn't be fucking around with the cards and missing my classes and not writing papers. I need to focus. And he does. He turns himself around. At the end of the story, he slowly gets his grades up to passing, starts going to classes, starts writing his papers, and just narrowly avoids the draft. And unlike most of his classmates, most of his dorm mates get shipped off. And at the end of the story, Peter and Carol finally consummate their relationship, but it's the last time, and she tells him, I'm leaving. I'm never coming back. I'm going to go protest. I feel like that's more important than going to college. And so it ends on this bittersweet note of how he's reminiscing about all these things and how she left, how she gradually got more radical, and he got better as a person and as a college student, barely made it out of there, and is looking back on how they all wanted to change the world back then, but none of them did. And there is once again kind of a sense of failure there, a sense of how King feels like his generation tried to set out to change the world, but failed in doing so. But there's a very hopeful note at the end of this story. One of the last lines of the story, to paraphrase it, is we tried to change the world, but we didn't do it. But the point is, we tried. And I think there's a lot to be said to that. There's a lot of humanity in that, and a lot of empathy to people, empathy to the human race. So, anyways, that's kind of the second story. This one's not as kind of plot filled or twist and turn. It's more of just kind of a long slice of life novella that kind of just goes on these events, and that's kind of everything I said is basically the plot of it. There's not any more really to it than that, but there's a lot in like character and a lot in like examining the times and people's personalities and things like that. There's a lot of that in there. So yeah, that's the second story, the titular story, Hearts in Atlantis. The first story was set in 1960. This one is set in 1966, and just in that short span of time, so much is different. Like the world King describes in the small town of Connecticut in the first story, and the world he describes in Orano in 1966, just a few years later, is so different. You know, it goes into a lot of detail of how everything's different. Because the first story, you know, not drawing attention to things, but pointing out things, how it was still very much like the 50s. Bobby's world is very much like the 50s. It's kids playing baseball and, you know, watching early rock and roll on American Bandstand, and you know, going to the Empire Theater and watching these monster movies and things like that. Peter Riley's world in 1966 as a freshman is already radically different. You know, again, not drawing detail to things, but it does mention in passing references to culture. It references the war. It references the popular soap opera at the time, Dark Shadows. It references the American broadcast of the BBC series, The Prisoner. It references Phil Axe and rock music, the Dave Clark Five. It references Dylan. Things like that. There's a lot of you know, a lot of change, you know, and it's interesting to think that that was real, that in such a short span of time in actual history, so much had changed culturally and artistically as well. And, you know, that's something I like about it. King has these eye for details and culture and setting scenes and describing characters that feels very realistic. You know, his stuff has the intimacy of memoirs, as a, you know, more than like fiction. It reads like people's real life stories, as opposed to just something someone made up. But yeah, and I like those things. I like those little attention to details, those little references he drops. And it's not calling attention to things or trying to show off and be like, oh, look what I know, look what I'm into, look at the books I like to read and the music I like. It's culturally setting up scenes, details of these things these characters would really be into and talk about and think about and listen to. So that's the second story. I'm rambling at this point, sorry. But yes, I really like it. It's my second favorite. And the other stories in here aren't bad either. I like the other ones. So, like, there's a story in here called Blind Willie. That's a really good. The last story is, you know, incredible. Which I can't wait to talk about that either. But all the stories in here are very poignant. They're very heartbreaking. They're very sad. They're very joyous. They're very hopeful. And it's all of those things that made me want to talk about this book. And that's why I'm doing a multi-part video series on it, because I wanted to give it kind of a thorough treatment and talk about each story individually. Because while I kind of view them as interconnected stories, as a, you know, telling a whole, like I think I view this more as a novel than a short story collection. Each story demands kind of thorough attention in its own right and stands up as its own thing. Similar to a certain movie series, like you can watch any of Star Wars, and those movies work independently, but also within the whole of the main story. And that's how I look at this. These stories operate independently. You can read them out of the context of the whole, and they stand up just as much as if you read them all together in the context of the book of Hearts of Atlantis. So anyways, that's my rambling video about the second story. I didn't really have to read my notes because there's not as much to talk about as in the first story. But I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll try to have a third video up soon. Which the third one, I believe, will be the story Blind Willie. So, I'm looking forward to talking about that one because that's really weird. That one's like kind of veers off into left field and comes back. You know, it's very different from the rest of the stories, and it's also just kind of one of the oddest. One of the oddest stories King has just written in general, as a short story writer. It's much shorter than the two novellas that start this book off. In fact, the rest of the stories in here are very standard short story length, but I will talk about that next time. So anyways, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I will try to have another video up soon. Until then, I will see you guys later. Bye.